Hi, I'm Shelley. I am making a short screencast to talk about definitions, particularly the definition of gene and genetics. This is created in a program called Prezi. Which definition should we use? If you perform an internet search for a definition, you probably will not find the best definition for a term. You might even find an inappropriate definition for a term. The best definition to use is the one that's in the class materials that I provide. I've chosen them carefully, and sometimes even these definitions are not completely aligned with one another. Sometimes they represent different aspects. For example, when you look up the definition of gene or the definition of genetics, what you find is not always exactly the same thing. For example, definitions of genetics include relating to or controlled by genes, a branch of biology, one's genetic makeup, and the study of heredity. Talking about which traits are controlled by genes, talking about the study of heredity or one's genetic makeup are not all exactly the same thing. I interpret the variations in these definitions to mean that genetics refers to which genes we have, which is our genetic makeup, to the characteristics controlled by genes, and to the study of heredity. Well, what is heredity? It's the study of inherited traits and their variation. Even the definition of inherited trait varies, or the definition of trait, I should say. Medical Webster's says a trait is an inherited characteristic. Non-medical Webster's says a trait is a distinguishing characteristic. Nature Genetics, the online education site called Skittable, says a trait is an observed variation in a specific character of an organism. An observed variation. They don't even say whether it's inherited. So is a trait inherited or not? Well, the nature-nurture debate continues. Actually, modern genetics is doing a much better job of describing whether traits are inherited than the genetics of the past. And really the answer is it varies on which trait you're talking about. For example, smoking in somebody who not smoking, lung cancer in someone who has smoked over a pack a day for 30 years, that trait of having lung cancer is mostly environmental. Long hair is environmental, but I could never grow my hair to be this long. My hair would never reach that point. So it's partly genetic, but also partly environmental. Basically, within traits, there's a range from entirely inherited, which it's hard to find examples of. Eye color is one, to entirely environmental, which could be hair color since people dye their hair. But obviously it has a genetic component too. Most traits are partly inherited and partly environmental, like weight, height, personality. In the past, genetics focused on single gene disorders like Tay-Sachs. But even in single gene disorders, there's variability. A single gene disorder is a trait that's caused by one gene as opposed to being caused by many genes. This boy, Connor, unfortunately suffers from Tay-Sachs disease and won't make it probably to his 5th birthday. This girl also has Tay-Sachs disease, Dakota. This girl. She has juvenile Tay-Sachs and she'll live longer because the mutation that she has is not as bad as the one Connor has, but they both have the same disease caused by the same gene. So even in single gene disorders, there's some variability. The differences in the definition of gene and genetics reflects the history of genetics. In the past, genetics classes focused on Punnett squares, which determine the probability that a particular allele will be passed on to one's offspring. Genetics focused on the two types of cell division, mitosis and meiosis. Well, mitosis is important, the cloning of cells to create an individual or to repair a cut or replace cells. Meiosis is important. This is a picture of sperm fertilizing an egg, and the sperm and the egg were created by cell division called meiosis. Single gene disorders like cystic fibrosis and also Down syndrome, which is not single gene but a chromosome disease, those are important too. But that is what we used to learn about in genetics. Now, in the year 2012, we've moved on to genomics and complexity. Initially, in the 1800s, we described traits in people and plants. We talked about diseases due to single genes, and then we thought about the structure of DNA. We talked about how genes code for proteins. Well, then we developed tools and computer assisted analysis and sharing of information, which allowed us to look at the whole genome and the interaction between all the genes. So now we're describing inherited traits in a different way. We're talking about the complex interactions between many genes with environmental factors, and also even how single gene traits caused by mostly one gene are influenced by other genes in the environment. So this is not your grandmother's genetics. We're in a new era. Along with this new era, we are not picturing people who have syndromes as this girl is pictured on Wikipedia. Would you want your daughter portrayed this way on the internet or in any other or in any other textbook? No, you'd want her portrayed like this, having fun, being a real person. We're not just focused on single genes, we're focused on genomics and complexity. We're learning about common diseases and the genetics of common diseases. So when we talk about genetics, we're not just talking about single gene disorders. We're talking about the genetics of diabetes, the genetics of cancer, the genetics of heart disease, how the genetics and environmental influences interact. The focus is on genomes and the interaction between genes with environmental influences, how genes are turned on and off, and even how genomes of different species are alike and different. As our understanding of genetics improves, the definition of genetics, the definition of gene, and the definition of heredity continue to evolve.